Welcome everybody to our author book talk with Dr. Ethan Blue from the University of Western Australia. My name is Bill Bush. I'm a professor of history at Texas A&M University, San Antonio. And I'm joined by my colleague at the University of Texas, Rio Grande Valley, George Diaz, who is an associate professor of history there. Our subject tonight is Dr. Blue's new book, The Deportation Express, A History of America Through Forced Removal. This is what it looks like. Dr. Blue is going to give a short presentation of about 25 minutes or so about his book. Then Dr. Diaz is going to interview him briefly, ask him a few questions about his project, his research, some of the interesting and provocative questions that are raised in the book. And then we'll open it up to audience Q&A. So we've got a very full schedule tonight. Before I go any further, I want to acknowledge the support that we've received for this event from the history program at A&M San Antonio and our awesome admin staff, Cynthia Alejos and Mimi Paulino, who have helped us get everything set up. And the Department of History and the Department of Mexican American Studies at UT Rio Grande Valley. This is an interesting project to put together, this event, because we're on opposite sides of the Pacific Ocean. It's been tricky, but I'm very excited that we're able to do this tonight. Tonight here, tomorrow morning, where Dr. Blue is in Perth, Australia. I'm going to make a land acknowledgement, and then I'm going to turn everything over to Dr. Diaz. I acknowledge that the land where I am, the Yanaguana, is named for the life-giving waters of the San Antonio River. Indigenous peoples have lived in this area for approximately 10,000 years, including the Payaya, Coahuiltecan, Lipan Apache, and Comanche, as well as other diasporic peoples from Mexico, the Southern Plains, and the Eastern United States. And very briefly, I'm going to introduce my colleague, Dr. Diaz, as an associate professor of history at the University of Texas, Rio Grande Valley, where he teaches U.S. history, borderlands, and Mexican American history. His award-winning book, Border Contraband, A History of Smuggling Across the Rio Grande, was published in 2015 by the University of Texas Press, is a social history of smuggling in the borderlands. Diaz is also the co-editor of the collection Border Policing, A History of Enforcement and Evasion in North America, also published by UT Press in 2020. His current book project, Mañana Land, Life and Death in a Mexican Prison in Texas, considers incarceration and capital punishment transnationally by recovering the voices of those ensnared by the carceral state. Dr. Diaz's research is informed by investigations in Mexican and US archives, as well as a lifetime of living on the border. Welcome, George.
Thank you very much. Thank you for joining us across the world for this presentation. It is my great honor to introduce Dr. Ethan Blue. Dr. Blue is a senior lecturer in history at the University of Western Australia. He has published widely in the United States and Australia and on the Australian penal systems as well. He lives in Perth, Australia. He's a UT Austin graduate, and his first book, Doing Time in the Great Depression, is far and away one of my favorite books on the topic. It is my great honor to introduce Dr. Ethan Blue.
Hey, thanks so much. Can you guys hear me all right? Yeah, cool. Okay, super. Yeah, thank you everybody at A&M San Antonio and UT Rio Grande Valley for having me. It really is a pleasure to be with you. Thanks to Professor Diaz and Bush and Mimi Paulino and Cynthia Alejos also for getting everything sorted on this side. Yeah, now by way of introduction, oh, actually I should share my screen. I meant to do that. Okay, so give me a second here while we get this to work. Share. And now going into Play from start. Good. Okay, hopefully this is showing up okay. Now, yeah, so I am a settler invader who was raised in Coast Miwok country on Turtle Island, also known as the Bay Area in California. I'm speaking as a settler invader on Wajak Noongar Boodja in Boorloo, also known as Perth, Western Australia. Sovereignty over Noongar land has never been ceded, and as I understand it, really can't be ceded because the relationship between people and country isn't the kind of thing that's alienable or tradable, or saleable. I acknowledge the elders of Wajak Noongar Boodja, past and present, and that I've benefited from being an invader, settler, migrant at least twice over. Where's my cursor? Here. Okay, so just some background also is kind of my broader intellectual project has been trying to make sense of what we've currently come to understand as the carceral state in all of its, well, in many of its manifestations. And so these are some of some of the bigger projects that I've been working on and trying to make sense of how this system of mass incarceration, as it's developed and grown over the 20th century and in the prehistory, of course, has taken shape. Here we've got some graphs of sort of incarceration numbers, which really start going through the roof in the 1970s, 80s, and through the 90s. And then the deportation numbers similarly, which lag a little bit, but then really kick off through the 90s. And how both of these really accelerate in late modernity. And as a historian, kind of what I see my work as being is trying to make sense of the prehistory of these systems and how they both have transformed and evolved within the broader carceral state, within a gendered racial capitalist world system. So that's kind of where I'm coming from with these projects. And now we'll go ahead and dig in properly. In 1922, Leo Stanley, who was the chief surgeon at San Quentin State Penitentiary, joined a deportation special train party that was bound from San Francisco to the Mexican border and then across the country to Ellis Island. And he would offer medical care to the party's members. Now, he'd done this many times before, and it was always kind of a treat for the doctor. It combined some of his great loves, the medical control of poor people, striving for a eugenically pure nation, and what's more, a free train trip across the country. He was quite a keen traveler. Now, among the unwilling passengers were a young Korean woman and her 5 children. Her husband had been jailed in Fresno, and as a result, Stanley tells us in his diaries, the woman had become a public charge. Because of this, he continued, it was found best to deport them to the point where they'd entered the country. Now, the Korean woman was distraught, and she confided to the doctor that, quote, she did not know what she would do when she arrived at Mexicali that night, for she knew no one in the town and was afraid that her children, one of whom had a fever, might want for food and a place to sleep. Now, Stanley thought he soothed the young woman's fears by telling her that, quote, the immigration authorities would be there to look out for her that night. Thus, Stanley reasoned, her tears were dried and her children played in the aisle of the train, unmindful of what would come that night or the next. Whatever took place beyond the border, it was neither Stanley's concern nor that of the state for which he worked, as long as she and her children never came back. Now, between 1914 and the Second World War, the U.S. Immigration Bureau and the Department of Labor sent reconfigured prison railroad cars on constant circuits around the country every 2 months or so. And they would gather up so-called undesirable aliens, people who were disdained for their poverty, their political radicalism, a criminal conviction, a physical disability, some sort of cognitive difference, or allegations of madness. And all of these were compounded by maligned national or ethno-racial difference. And the trains then conveyed these folks to ports and borders for exile. The trains were the culmination of a century's worth of immigration law, materialized in the steel of its rail networks and the force of its engines, expanded in complex links of public administrative bureaucracy and private corporate power. It was a complex network, or put another way, a politico-technical assemblage that conjoined a host of security-oriented laws, agencies, techniques, and enabled the will and desire for an expansive understanding of national protection. Now, here's sort of a route of the train that I trace in the book, and we'll come back to this shortly. Now, of course, the history of trains is well known, or at least widely celebrated in the United States. The trains are generally seen as this wonderful advancement of American civilization. You know, that's all in quotation marks, right? And so we've got this image in the top right across the continent where the train is this engine of modernity and Christianity and civilization, forward progress of sort of the westward flow of empire as a good thing, but, you know, according to these ideologies, literally leaving First Nations people choking in the smoke of the image. The trains, of course, did play a really crucial part in the colonization of the United States, or of North America, or Turtle Island, by the United States, knitting together all of the resources, firstly by knitting together continental space, enabling the new commodities or resources stolen from or pulled from indigenous lands to be circulated through global capitalist networks, and then also to send large numbers of troops to conquer the West, as well as large numbers of settler invaders to populate, and through brute fact of numbers to seize the land. The fact that Chinese and Irish and other sorts of reviled immigrants were among the most important builders of the railroads in the 19th century, and that their inheritors and their descendants are loaded aboard the deportation trains is a less frequently told part of the story. Now, in my book, I argue that the trains were mobile carceral spaces, and I argue that the history reveals the deportation journey as a process through which national territory, political sovereignty, and biological community, these are three key features of modern nations, how these were created and contested. Previous kinds of deportation had been largely violent, were often locally driven, and were quite expensive and relatively ad hoc. But the use of the railroad, perhaps the exemplary technology of industrial modernity, sublimated racial violence into spatial control and facilitated the mass expulsion of the so-called undesirable, and it did it on a continental scale. Now, the numbers of people who were deported in the period that I'm looking at, roughly 1914 to 1941, weren't huge. Maybe a couple thousand people a year early on, a few thousand in the 20s, and then around 20,000 at the end of the decade. Official federal numbers suggest there are around 1 million people deported between 1914 and 1945, but these numbers are very, very soft and don't count quote unquote voluntary departures, which is a huge number of people, as we know. But the focus on numbers is less important to the study than the creation of the infrastructures and the creation of these networks and systems that I'm trying to understand and make sense of in the book. And so the ways in which the trains sort of enabled the nativists' longstanding racial desires for a quote unquote pure country to be put into practice. Now, the book makes a handful of I'm going to go like with some of the big arguments, and then we'll move into the smaller stuff in a couple minutes. The book makes a handful of interrelated arguments about the significance of deportation trains as a settler colony within a global racial capitalist system. Now, for the first part of this, what this means is that I treat deportation as a second order process of settler colonialism. And what I mean by this is that the first order of business for a settler invader regime is to try to clear indigenous people off of the land, to control them, and then free the land for white profitability and settler profit. So that's the first order. The second order of business then is controlling who gets to be a settler and who doesn't. Okay, so that's what I mean when I say it's a second order process of settler colonization. But this was not materially or administratively, this was not an easy process for the US state. The millions and millions of people across the planet had been torn from their worlds by the same processes of imperialism and capitalism, essentially industrializing capitalism, and had been torn asunder from their homes, and many tried to get to the United States as what was becoming the center of the global racial capitalist system. The US is situated at the nexus of the Atlantic world and the Pacific world, and some 26 million people head to the US between 1870 and 1920, right? To produce, to pull the wealth from the land, to make a living for themselves, and so on. And so the US deportation system is trying to control who gets to be a settler and who doesn't. Now, I argue also that the deportation system is a complex network or an assemblage with a load of different moving parts that begin to be linked together. And I argue that the deportation assemblage created new possibilities of a more tightly integrated carceral welfare deportation network, first of all, and that had new apparatuses of capture and new apparatuses of flow. Okay, so those are some of the concepts that I'm trying to work with. And these had vertical and horizontal dimensions. The horizontal dimensions of the deportation apparatus means that all of a sudden this new vast geographic space of the continent is increasingly linked together by the new technology of the train and the new technology of the telegraph. And the telegraph always runs right next to the train tracks, right? So these go hand in hand together and enable new horizontal processes of communication and of moving people quickly and cheaply and rapidly across vast horizontal space. It also creates new vertical links between different levels of the state, between the federal government, right, the Federal Bureau of Immigration and Department of Labor, the state level, say a state warden of a prison system, and then at the municipal level of the administrator of a county workhouse, a county jail, and so forth. And so there's an increasingly vertically coherent carceral welfare deportation state that's being created by this system. It's also creating new linkages between the different branches of the so-called carceral archipelago, to use kind of fancy pants Foucauldian terminology, right? So there's new connections between prisons, hospitals, workhouses, mental institutions, and so forth, right? These are often understood to be separate and distinct institutions, and of course, administratively they are. But the deportation regime, by trying to connect all of these people by their various categories of quote unquote undesirability, now are increasingly interwoven and interlinked. And so I treat this as a, again, for the fancy pants language, as a biopolitical racializing assemblage that as a net that captures and then expels people for a host of different reasons and concepts and differences. The deportation system, of course, was never as tightly knit as its designers wanted, but the state agents who developed it thought it was a perfectible system, and they really would give it a go, as it were. It's again never airtight, and in the book I show many instances of how people escape, evade, and resist it, but it still grows into become a terribly fearsome system. Now, the book is structured around a composite deportation train journey, and each chapter is a stop on the train's trip. And so chapters begin in Seattle, Portland, San Francisco, Denver, and move across the country, and each chapter tells the story of the people who were loaded aboard the train there, and their journeys around the world and into the US carceral welfare and deportation regime. An empirical description of the train's existence, as well as the passengers' forced coexistence, I think provides a unique synthesis for a lot of US scholarship. And the deportation train made for a complicated social space. It was a hybrid of the poorhouse, the prison, the hospital, and the asylum, and moreover, it was on wheels. It was as racially diverse as any city in the country, and more diverse than many. It was the deportation train confined many of the people deemed contemptible or pathetic. The procurer and the prostitute, the pauper and the lunatic, the anarchist and the disabled worker, the Chinese laborer, all considered racially ineligible or biologically ineligible for citizenship. And the train gathered people marked by these multiple and intersecting forms of difference, and rendered them into the conceptual opposite of the virtuous citizen. And when the state worked with private transportation firms to run the trains and the globe-spanning networks of which it was a part, it helped produce the inside and the outside of the American nation as a carceral state. It limned qualities of belonging, it institutionalized strategies and technologies of otherness, and in so doing, produced the actual processes of alienation, of marginalization, and of casting people out. By materially and administratively linking the United States continental carceral archipelago and serving as a closed conduit for moving peoples from interior disciplinary spaces to beyond its increasingly fortified borders, the deportation train was an engine in the production of American being and American citizenship, and in the destroying or attempting to destroy the possibilities of lives lived across these borders. Now, I'll just very briefly go into some of the chapter structure. As I said, the chapters are based around individual stops on the trains, and they tell the stories of individual people who were loaded aboard the trains at each stop and their journeys through global racial capitalism and then into the carceral welfare and deportation state. It's very much of a spatial history, and so it traces a lot of the paths that people travel, the conditions of labor and life that they experience along the way, and the ways that they get brought into the disciplinary regime. The first part of the book also looks at a lot of the deportation staff, the deportation agents who ran the train, to get a sense of their lives, their motivations, and how this massive regime doesn't just grow out of nowhere, but is actually constructed, is actually built by human beings, by actual people, in many respects, who are just trying to do their jobs or who are motivated by all sorts of racial animus as well. The eastbound leg of the journey mostly looks at people who come from the European world or the Atlantic world. The westbound leg of the journey mostly focuses on people who are from the United States' more colonized worlds and Pacific realms. And I'm happy to talk in more detail about all of this too. But I want to just briefly talk about a couple people, very briefly, given our timing, who I focus on in the book. Chapter 9 looks at Indelicio and Genero Huerto, who are from Michoacan. They are driven from Michoacan by the Mexican Revolution, by inflation, by effects of land centralization during their porfiriato, and they work as traqueros, right? So they're doing industrial and infrastructural work of labor and rail maintenance in the Midwest. And in the chapter, I talk about their particular experiences of traquero life and labor, and then also the particular conditions of emergent anti-Mexican racism in the Midwest, which is different than, or has different sort of chronology than anti-Mexican racisms along the border. But then one of the brothers, Indelicio, winds up being alleged to be mad, and so is incarcerated at the State Asylum number 2, which was a really horrific institution characterized by a great deal of death and essentially torturous treatment of people who are considered mad. And so it's a quite sad story of him and his brother's very strained relationship as a result of his incarceration and being locked up. One of the things that I think is worth stressing is the conditions of the US-Mexico border and border policing that these people's story reveals is of the border as an element of elective porosity, which permits flows of labor during conditions of wartime labor shortage, as the US sees it. But people whose labor is provisionally allowed are subject to deportability as an ontological permanent status, right? In Delicio's the allegations of his madness mean that he is no longer eligible to remain despite any necessity of labor. Another story comes from that of Louis Mo. Louis Mo is from China. He lives in Japan for a little while. He can't live in the United States because of the Chinese Exclusion Act. He winds up living in Mexico for some years, living and traveling through Mexico, and then become only, during the Mexican Revolution, there's a ascendant anti-Chinese violence as a sort of form of wartime revolutionary racial nationalism that punches downward against the Chinese in some respects, so as well as the animus towards the U.S. In any case, during the Mexican Revolution, Pancho Villa leads the raid into Columbus, New Mexico. Rushing through this, so forgive me. Then General Blackjack Pershing leads the punitive expedition into Mexico to go after Pancho Villa. Some of you may be familiar with the story, but I wasn't when I began researching this, so I thought this was pretty fascinating. Anyway, the U.S. had a great deal of trouble supplying its troops on the punitive expedition, and so they wind up largely relying on Chinese in Mexico to provide a lot of the infrastructural labor and support that the U.S. Army was unable to provide for itself. Louis Mo wound up being one of the people who was helping to provide support for the U.S. Army in Pershing's expedition. The expedition was a complete failure. As a result, Louis Mo and 500 odd other Chinese refugees are given special permission to enter the United States along with Pershing, despite the Chinese Exclusion Act. He winds up being alleged of being mad also, but this is only after he's been essentially working as an unfree laborer on U.S. Army bases across Texas and other places. He's accused of being mad. He gets in trouble for robbing a store where he's working and also for flirting with a white woman. And one thing I think is quite fascinating here is the way that through Louis Mo's life, you can see these journeys through global capital, through revolution, through racialization, across the border, and then the particular conditions of white rule and white masculinity in Texas, where he is protesting against the conditions of his exploitation as an unfree worker on military bases, because these guys aren't allowed to leave the military bases. And he's protesting against this by stealing from the cash drawer, and he's also challenging the bases of white masculine rule by flirting with a white woman. He doesn't get lynched for this. He does get in a great deal of trouble for it, and is eventually locked up at the San Antonio jail, and then the Southwestern Insane Asylum, I think it was called, in San Antonio too, before he was eventually loaded aboard the deportation train. A last story that I'll share shows the border not as one of selective porosity, but of a harder militarized border. And this is a journey of 3 men from Meiji, Japan. I traced their journeys across the Pacific, their lives in Peru, conditions of comprador capitalism and so-called coolie labor, and their lives and careers doing infrastructural work too. There's a common theme of infrastructural labor here. Before they leave Peru, they eventually work and live in Tampico for a while in the US-owned oil industries. But then again, during the Mexican Revolution, they try to get into the United States. They are captured outside of El Paso by armed Chinese inspectors. And again, this demonstrates the militarized denial of entry for Asian travelers, and the ascendance of this very, very hard border as a new kind of regime. So those are just some examples of what I call the entangled microhistories that drive the book, and that the book is based around. And just the book closes with World War II, and when the deportation trains were no longer used to bring people to the border quite so much, it still happened a little bit, but the trains were then repurposed for Japanese internment. All right, so rather than taking people from interior disciplinary sites to the borders and the coasts, the deportation train was basically reversing its journey and taking people from the coasts and bringing them into new carceral sites of the Japanese internment camps and concentration camps. After World War II, you've got the transition from the age of rail to the age of automobility and air travel. You've got Greyhound buses for deportation, of course, as this new technology and this new infrastructure, and then airport and airplane services too. And now we've got this strange combination of a JPATS system, as well as the resurgent privatization through ICE Air, so-called ICE Air, Swift Air. And these are just the bottom right images are ones I recently found about the Haitian deportations in September 2021, which used a combination of US Coast Guard planes stopping at the El Paso airport. There was some out of San Antonio as well, I believe. And then I started to do some research into iAero as a private firm profiting off of deportation traffic. And I think there's a lot more work to be done there. In terms of the continuity of these forms of militarized border policing, selective control, interior raids and other enforcement procedures through the criminalization and crimmigration law, as an ongoing public-private system. But I want to close with a postcard that came out from the American Committee for the Protection of the Foreign-Born. And this was a leftist organization that mobilized in protection of political prisoners and people who are facing deportation. And on the right-hand side of the card, you can't read it too well, it says, Native and foreign-born, Negro and white, unite. Right? And there are calls to release all foreign-born people held for deportation. And one of the things that I think is really remarkable about this postcard is it shows an early critique of the interconnected carceral state, right? This is the kind of stuff that intellectuals and activists are, I think, now increasingly starting to understand. But here's something that these folks in the 30s were very clearly identifying in the figure of this top hat wearing octopus, right? And so you've got linking corporate power, the carceral state, and racial capitalism. So political economy is represented there in the arm that says wage cuts. It's connected to domestic penalty, which is through the idea of frame-ups and lynchings, and connected also to international removal and deportation. And then it shows the masses of people behind it who are threatened by it, but also I think in a way it can be seen as organized and marching in some ways against it, in ways that I think are important for us to trace in the past, but also to continue to see in the current moment. Okay, I'll draw to a close there, and thank you all for having a listen. And should I stop screen sharing? Maybe
You could leave up the flyer. Unless you want to, why don't you put it down so we could, get a better look at you.
Yeah. All right.
Thank you. Thank you for the excellent presentation. I feel like I learned a lot, and I have some questions that I prepared, but then just listening to the presentation, I have a few more, if you don't mind.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, so I've been reading your book, and I've enjoying the presentation, but maybe something that I'm kind of more curious about that is in the book, but maybe wasn't in the presentation overtly, was this is happening during the depths of Jim Crow and segregation in the United States. And on this train, is it segregated? Are there people is there a hierarchy in terms of like undesirability in which some people are more stigmatized on the same train based on whatever circumstance? So I was kind of curious about that.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, just on the segregation part, one of the things that's really fascinating is that there are on the state side, there are the white guards, private guards, and then Department of Immigration guards. So these are all white folks, but then there's also African-American porters who are working on the train. And so they are subservient to the racial, anti-Black racial system. And yet at the same time, they're providing service to this system itself. And so there's really interesting and complicated sort of racial dynamics in terms of anti-Blackness that's going on here. The fundamental racisms and antagonisms within the deportation regime isn't structured around anti-Blackness. It's never not there, but that's not like the driving key. Also worth, of course, pointing out that Plessy versus Ferguson, right, the fundamental racial segregation law, was based around segregation on train cars. Um, but in terms of the actual spatial organization of the train cars, as I understand it, there's a distinction between people who are considered um, dangerous and people who are like merely pathetic. And it's super terrible language that I'm using, but this is my understanding of how the officials then understood it. Um, and so if somebody was like a criminal, had a criminal conviction, or was an anarchist, or often if you were simply Chinese, you would be loaded into a car with bars across the window. So like a much more explicitly carceral militarized car. If like the Korean woman with her 5 kids would be considered more like merely pathetic rather than explicitly dangerous. And so she might be kept in a car that wasn't as hardened, wasn't as carceral. So there are these sorts of distinctions. Eventually, I think they are increasingly moving towards increasingly militarized cars. So everybody is treated as if they might become a source of danger. Yeah, so this is some of the ways that space is organized within the train. And then there's evidence that people aboard the train organized themselves spatially. So there's some indication that, you know, in the Leo Stanley diaries, he talks about a handful of guys who just got out of I think Walla Walla prison, and they sat together and played cards. So there's some internal self organization. The sources on this are pretty slim, so you got to piece it together from sort of the scraps that remain.
Thank you. I thought that the presence of the porters was fascinating in reading the book. And also it reminds me very much of prisons that are segregated by race, but also by offense. There's people who are nonviolent versus people who are violent. And it shows that like this train is effectively a prison on wheels.
Exactly. Yeah, and there was one, and I talk a little bit in the book about an experiment with one particular prison rail car, the Lorenzo, and one of my slides I think showed it. This was a train car that had staterooms, and so the guys who ran the train thought this was a great idea because you could then spatially contain. It was basically like a mini panopticon. It was like mini sort of cellular organizations. So the guards could keep a so-called mad person in one carriage or in one room, a woman and her kids in another, a dangerous anarchist in a third, and then a Chinese family, and then a Mexican family in the one next to that, and they would not contaminate each other. Right, in using that sort of carceral Foucauldian notion of spatial segregation and spatial containment. The officials eventually wound up deciding that this train was too expensive, and so they just decided to go to the open carriage plan. So the guards were then in charge of segregating people by space and race, rather than using architectural controls.
Going over the book, there were so many fascinating stories and so many things that you uncovered. So I guess for people who haven't maybe picked up the book yet, what was the most surprising thing you uncovered in your research, and how did it influence your study?
Oh boy, it's hard to say. I was constantly surprised. I would like the story of Louis Mo. And I mean, actually, one of the things that I thought was really amazing was focusing on individual people allowed me these entire worlds to unfold, right? And so individual people's journeys and lives are amazing and remarkable. And I don't want to, and show the journeys that people travel, their experiences show profound insight into the nature of modern racism, racial capitalism, the carceral state, and will to survive and persist across all of these quite dominating systems. So just the story of Louis Mo, I learned that there were these Korean guys getting deported out of Nebraska. And what this was a revelation to me. I hadn't been super deep in Korean immigration history, but most Korean immigration history focuses on the post-World War II, and looks at the West Coast or Hawaii. Some of the earlier stuff looks at Hawaii too. But nevertheless, one of the things I found that there was this upsurge of Korean revolutionary nationalism in central Nebraska. And this school of Korean revolutionary nationalists were developing a military strategy so that they could then return from Nebraska to Korea in their efforts to try to overthrow the occupying Japanese government. And I had no idea that there were these Korean revolutionary nationalists in the middle of Kearney, in Kearney, Nebraska, in the early 20th century. And so this was just absolutely amazing to get to unfold.
Well, one of the things that I think that it comes full circle is they got to Nebraska by rail, probably.
Yeah, for sure. And also, I mean, as I understand it, they came to Nebraska by virtue of these quasi-imperial missionary networks, right, that had traveled from the US and then were trying to spread Christianity and missionary networks through Asia. And so some folks from Korea saw this as an opportunity to come to the US and then use this as a site of political organizing against Japanese occupation. Actually, and in ways that are similar to, in chapter 2, South Asian radicals who are organizing along the Pacific, along the coast of the Pacific Northwest, also organizing against British colonialism in India, and interestingly, the ways that the Irish and the way that Joe Kennedy, in the Butte, Montana chapter, how he's organizing as a political radical, and other sort of Irish revolutionary nationalists are organizing against England and English imperialism in Ireland at the same time.
Thank you. Well, the questions are coming in. I don't want to, talk your ear off. So let me see what some of these questions are. Amy Porter asks, where are you able to find these stories? And can you speak about your sources?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for that. Yeah, methodologically, the way that I did this was, well, first I learned about the trains, and this is about, I learned about the trains just through reading Leo Stanley, that weird prison doctor, through his stuff. I can get into that a little bit, but I learned about the trains, went to the National Archives in Washington, DC. I found the itineraries that were sent to the main deportation agents, right? So Henry Weiss, Leo Russell, Edwin Klein, every so often they would get a telegram or they'd get a message saying, okay, here's your itinerary. You're going to start off in Washington, DC, and you're going to pick up these 3 guys. You're going to go to New York, and you're going to pick up these 4 people. In Chicago, pick up them. And each one would have a case file number on the itinerary, right? And then I would call up the case file numbers from the itineraries. And then the case file numbers were these lengthy, well, sometimes very short, sometimes quite lengthy documents in which the immigration authorities were building a case to deport people. Okay, so, but anyway, these were very situated, very, top-down documents designed to dominate and expel, but they could still be read against the grain for people's testimonies, for their life journeys, for their experiences and their travels. And so those were my main sources. Yeah, and I read through a great many of these. And then I chose the ones that I thought were most, that shed the most light on the systems of global transportation and journeys through global racial capital, as well as emplacement and experiences of the carceral welfare deportation state. And then I sort of cross-indexed that with geography so that each different stop on the train journey, this composite train journey, would sort of satisfy a lot of those conceptual and geographic elements. So so that was sort of my method of constructing of my sources, and then constructing the narrative, the spatial narrative, and then the historical and analytical structure.
Thank you. That dovetails well with our next question. So this next question is by Kevin Guana, and it asks, would you, Dr. Blue, differentiate or elaborate on the difference between racial capitalism versus racist capitalism? I'm assuming there's a difference. Thank you. I could reread it.
No. So if I heard it right, the difference between racial capitalism and racist capitalism.
That's correct.
Well, I guess I'll kind of. Racial capitalism is a term that comes from Cedric Robinson, who's the sort of author of Black Marxism and a key sort of theorist key Marxist theorist and key Black Marxist theorist. And I guess the idea is that racial capitalism is racist capitalism and racist capitalism is racial capitalism, all of which is to say capitalism. Like there's no version of capitalism that isn't always already structured by racial domination as a fundamental mode of how capitalism as a world system organizes people biologically and geographically and hierarchically in order to justify stealing land and exploiting or enslaving people. And so this whole system is never not racist. From its inception, it's thoroughly structured by racism. And I would just add to that too, by gender, right? Because any sort of notion of a raced body and of a coherent racial group has a sense of reproducibility over time. And so therefore, ideas about sex, gender, desire, these things are always already also going to be integrated within this system. Does that make sense?
Oh, well, I think so, yes. And actually that dovetails perfectly with our next question. So I'll read the next question by Jennifer Correa. So let me read this question. Thank you, Dr. Blue, for your interesting presentation. I admit I have not yet read your book, but based on what I've read so far, I was wondering if you could speak to how gender played a role in these deportation trains and how women may have experienced being labeled, quote, mad, and thus not part of the US body politic. And this person is a sociology major at Texas A&M San Antonio.
Yeah, cool. Thank you for that. Well, the gender plays key roles in a handful of different ways. One is, first of all, through definitions of sexual morality and sexual immorality. And so a fair number of sex workers get deported as being sort of morally questionable or experience, suffering from moral turpitude and so on. So in any case, a lot of women who are sex workers get loaded aboard the trains. And so this is then producing ideas of proper heteropatriarchal families over time. And in terms of the conditions it was also about conditions of madness, women who are considered mad. Well, where to start? A handful of one woman who I write about on the train was considered senile, and so Mary Andrade was from the Azores, and the actual conditions that she experienced. She moved to the U.S. She was living within the Azorean Portuguese-speaking communities across California with her family. The longer standing traditions in the Azores would be that you would look after your kin, you would look after your family when they were unwell or aged or having some sort of cognitive difference. The particular conditions in Californian modernity were such that families were not able to look after loved ones who didn't fit cognitive norms. And so she was then locked up at the Stockton State Asylum and then later on expelled back to the Azores, where one of her kids could look after her. We don't know what happened to her really at that point. But then, so anyway, women who were considered not to fit in within heteropatriarchal norms or who exceeded the bounds of, or who are cognitively different could be or would be loaded aboard the train. There's a woman who I didn't get to really focus on, who was this was in Utah, an Irish woman who suffered from manic depressive insanity, they called it, and she wouldn't speak when she was asked questions, and then the officials said, no, she doesn't want a lawyer to represent her because she didn't say she wanted a lawyer to represent her. Therefore, we can go ahead. Let's just go ahead with the proceedings. Yeah, I could also talk about other women who were deported with their kids who were cognitively different too. But it all speaks to the goals of particular kinds of social reproduction, right? Of reproducing a particular kind of biological population into the future. And around the kinds of work that women were supposed to do, fundamentally as reproductive labor rather than productive labor. And yeah, a chapter where I talk about an English woman and her son, and the son has a cognitive difference, and they're expelled for those very reasons.
Thank you. A lot of our students in the audience might be learning about the deportation trains for the first time. That being said, there's plenty in the news today. What lesson from this era in U.S. history might teach us about immigration policing today?
Wow. Where to start? I mean, I guess, firstly, it's a hard one to answer. One thing that I think is useful is if you look at the way a system is built, then, I mean, I guess I take the line from Assata Shakur, who is the anti-prison organizer, Black Power organizer, who talked about a wall is just a wall; it can be torn down. And then, I'm showing a bit of my own sort of sensibilities here. The creation of this massive deportation regime was not inevitable, I would say. The creation of this regime was built piece by piece over time by people. And the kinds of political and administrative power that it generated and sustained, I would also suggest can be unmade through political action, through organizing, through different ways of imagining the ways that society can work. And I think this sort of history, I like to think this sort of history can show ways that other worlds are possible, that these systems aren't inevitable, other worlds can be made.
Thank you. It seems like we have time for one last question, so I'll ask this question by Jennifer Herrera Solis. So the question is, which is your favorite or most interesting story?
Oof. You know what I might do? It's hard to say, but I might close with, this is not a favorite and it's not a good story, but it's an interesting and I think an illustrative story. Henry Weiss, who was the guy who ran the trains. He was an immigrant himself. He was from the Ottoman Empire, from Constantinople. He moved to the US as a 24-year-old, I think it's 24, 26, can't remember for sure. Anyway, very hardworking, very upwardly mobile. He speaks like 7 languages. He gets a job eventually gets a job. He gets US citizenship, gets a job with the Immigration Bureau. He gets yanked around by the Bureau quite a bit and maltreated. Other less talented people get promoted ahead of him. He eventually finds his way moving up the deportation bureaucracy by running the deportation trains. And officials see him as a really good worker. He gets all of this amazing upward mobility as a result, but he wants to travel the whole time, and he's away from his family from 1914 through 1916. In 1916, he actually dies aboard the train. He had worked through injury, worked through pain before, but he's a hard worker, and dedicated to his job. His daughter, his wife tries to come out to Chicago to see him. She's unable to get there soon enough. His family is then broke. They've become public. Effectively, the threat is that they're going to become public charges, like so many of the people who were aboard the train. They had citizenship, so they weren't likely to get, they weren't going to get deported, but they were going to suffer a great deal from losing the primary breadwinner. The daughter sends letters to the Immigration Bureau saying, hey, can you at least pay to remove his body from Chicago and bring him back to California? Can you help pay his medical costs because we're broke? The the guys who run the train for the Nickel Plate Railroad say, yeah, we'll send your dad's body back free of charge. He's been we've worked with him well for years. The Immigration Bureau says something to the effect of, sentiment cannot guide us in these sorts of matters. There's been no money allocated for this sort of thing, so we can't help you. And the daughter is left in mourning and broke and having to pay all of these medical costs too. I bring that up just to show how this system is a system that even the people who helped build the system, and nobody helped build this system more than Henry Weiss did, this system was a machine that ground up the people even who helped build it. He gave his life to build this system, which I think is an enormously tragic story. Yeah.
Wow, it's very moving. I remember reading that in the book, and I thought, it's almost like the gears in the wheel, and he's just another cog in the machine.
That's right.
Thank you. I think that we're almost at time, but it looks like we've actually, used our time really, really well. Dr. Bush, you want to come back and we can, say our farewells?
Definitely. I want to just make a quick comment that if you haven't picked up this book yet, it is an amazing feat of research. The narrative stories of the individuals, which we've been talking about for the last hour, are incredibly reconstructed, vividly told. And one of the things I think is just such a great strength is how those stories really bring to life these sort of theoretical concepts that we talk about a lot. They really put a sort of living human face on concepts like the carceral state or racial capitalism or settler colonialism. So I would just strongly encourage people, if you haven't had a chance to read it yet, I would encourage you to give it a read. It's a really amazing study. I want to thank Dr. Blue and Dr. Diaz for a terrific hour of conversation. I want to thank our audience members for their great questions. And once again, I want to thank Cynthia Alejos and Mimi Paulino for supporting us in putting this together. The session is being recorded, and once we have the recording edited a little bit, we will put it out for the world. So if you have some friends or colleagues that didn't get a chance to attend that are interested, it'll be available.
And if anybody who's listening wants to, drop a line, my email is available, and I'm more than happy to continue the conversation.
Yeah, and you know what? We will post that with the recording.
Cool.
Your contact information. So if people want to follow up with you, they can.
Super.
Great. Well, thank you, everyone. And this concludes our session. So thanks very much.